Hey, thank you guys for coming today. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Daniella Rolle. I am a CivicSpark and EcoAdapt Fellow. I am also the Program Associate of the National Adaptation Forum. I just want to say thank you guys for coming out today specifically to talk more about how the importance of storytelling and crafting messages is important in all of our work related to climate action and adaptation. At times like this, it is becoming increasingly important with everything going around, just to learn more about how to communicate with people of diverse audiences and how to plant the seeds for climate action and solutions. So, some of you may be here today because you want to learn more about how to get people to care about and support the initiatives that you're doing in your own local communities, or you're interested in learning how to reach different kinds of audiences that you haven't been able to reach in the past, such as youth, minorities, non-English speaking communities, and even across political lines. So today we're going to listen to a number of panelists, and hopefully you guys can take some useful tips and tools away with you guys. But first, I would like to just start with some housekeeping rules. As you guys are all trickling into this Zoom webinar, I please ask you that you keep yourselves muted for the panel discussion portion of our webinar. If you guys do have questions, there will be another 25 minutes after our panel discussion for an open Q&A. And so that will be the time where you can drop all your questions in the Zoom chat as the panel discussion is progressing. And we will be compiling and monitoring the Zoom chat for our open Q&A later. And please, if you guys haven't done so already, introduce yourselves in the chat. Say your name, your affiliation, and potentially where you're zooming in from today, just so we know who's chiming in. So I will get it started to introduce our panelists today. So first up, we have Pearl Marvell, who is an editor at Yale Climate Connections. Much of her recent work has focused on creating a climate change-informed Spanish-speaking audience with the Ask the Climate Expert platform that's done in all Spanish. We also have Greg Jacobs here today, who is the Emmy Award-winning Director of the 102 Minutes That Changed America, which was a 9/11 documentary, and one of his most recent film projects was the Here Now Project, which is a climate change documentary. And last, but certainly not least, we have Zoya, who is a reporter from Grist. A lot of her recent coverage has been on the front line of disaster communities in North Carolina, looking at the impacts of extreme weather events and how that shapes different people's political beliefs. And so we can get us all kicked off. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And something I wanted to start us off by is just understanding for the rest of the audience how all of our work has this continuous weave and a thread through some of the projects that we've been doing recently. And one of them is just being we have been using extreme weather events to help people grasp some of the tangible impacts of climate change and understanding that this is a current problem and not just a future problem. And so, in terms of messaging, we have moved far beyond just framing climate change as this distant threat, but we're also looking to figure out how to actually get people to understand that this is a current threat that we need to address now. So, my first question to our panelists is just how do you use extreme weather events in your own work to frame or contextualize climate change, particularly in helping people connect the current events to climate change?
I guess I'll get started. Thank you, Daniela, and thank you for everyone for being here. It's so great to be able to talk to so many people who are on the front lines of this, all of this essential work. My co-director John Siskel and I are our new documentary, The Here Now Project, which hopefully some of you got a chance to take a look at over the last week, is essentially it looks at a year in the life of climate change through the eyes and the cameras of ordinary people around the globe. So we basically took the year 2021, which was a terrible year for the human habitability of the planet, and kind of tracked over the course of the year a number of the climate accelerated disasters, the heat dome, the Texas ice disaster, um, fires everywhere, dust storms, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea behind using kind of the footage that ordinary people have posted online is that social video has kind of become the way ordinary people communicate extreme weather. And it's the way people talk about it. Oh my God, did you see that? And it's the way people learn about it. So I think our thought was that if we can just use this, no narration, no talking heads, just the ordinary footage from ordinary people, it would be a way of kind of using a universal language of extreme weather to crack through people's defenses about how they receive climate stories. And one of the things that it ended up doing, which I think we were not necessarily expecting when we started, was using this footage. It's like this is the primary source material for climate change, in a sense, in our world. And what it ends up doing is it allows you to tell the hardest thing to explain about climate change, which is its global simultaneity. So by using all this footage from around the world, we're able to capture the sense that it is happening everywhere, all at once, to all of us. And it's not just a kind of a whack-a-mole series of individual events. The climate change is the connection between all these things and not the actual events. And so that is, I think, proven to be a very powerful thing. And our hope is that it then becomes a tool that people can use, the folks like you who are on the front lines of doing this work, to say, hey, take a look at this, and we can have a very different conversation. If there's a gap in urgency that you feel between how you generally feel about climate change and what you need to be feeling, this will help close that gap, and then we can talk about ways to change it. So that is, I think, the intent of the Here Now project, and hopefully people have gotten a chance to look at it, and or will get a chance over the next few days.
Um, Hi everyone, I'm Zoya. I write for Grist, and I'm really thrilled to be here. One of the things that I've learned covering extreme weather over the past year or so, Grist sent me and one of my fellow reporters on sort of a fact-finding mission across the country. We traveled to 8 different states, talked to communities who had undergone severe disasters from hurricanes to floods to wildfires, and tried to learn, what motivates them to, like how did that disaster really change their perspective on climate change, on politics, local and national, and anything else really that we could find. And what we learned is that, disasters are in some ways the lowest hanging climate fruit. There is a natural inroad there with communities who might not otherwise be thinking about climate change or understand it, which is totally understandable. Something we learned during our travels is that it's not always necessary to say the words climate change. They've become somewhat politicized, as many of us know, and perhaps there isn't really a need right now when you go into a community and you say, "Hey, well, do you know this is climate change doing this to you?" Instead it's a conversation about, was your government there for you? Were your neighbors there for you? What do you need to recover? How are you thinking differently about where your house is, where your town is, where your downtown buildings are situated? And that kind of gets us a little further than just a conversation about, whether climate change is quote unquote real.
You
I
got
think I
muted.
was
There you
just
go.
muted, but that's a good place for me to, maybe it was a secret nudge to sort of like put a pause there. But that's so anyway, more on that later. But that is sort of the takeaways that we learned is that there are so many ways to talk about this, and disasters really are a kind of a an unfortunate but handy way to make connections with communities that wouldn't otherwise exist.
Yeah, my experience has been a little bit different in the fact that I've been working in Spanish for the past 2 years, 2.5 years now. I came in and there was already a very well established process of covering extreme weather in English. We have two meteorologists that we work with. we've got Bob Henson and Jeff Masters, and they already have such a huge following of kind of extreme weather nerds, in English. So we had Yale Climate Connections already had this great audience that was already connecting the dots between climate change and extreme weather. The reason that I was even brought on in the first place was because the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication realized that 64% of Hispanic people in the US are worried about climate change, and particularly so if their dominant language is Spanish. So we started to cover extreme weather in 2023. So we started with the hurricane season. And we went from having, like 4 people that were our audience in Spanish to thousands and then tens of thousands as we started to roll out, unfortunately, during a very active hurricane season. It's been what I appreciate that in Spanish, it's not as politicized. There is this acceptance of that there is that connection between climate change and extreme weather, and we notice that in so many different ways. And one like very simple, kind of example of that is on Facebook. When we're publishing on social media, you obviously get the people that are saying that climate change is a hoax and all of that. When we started to do it in Spanish, we were getting thank you so much for this information, much appreciated, and sharing it and like sending hearts. And our whole scientific team was like blown away by that. They weren't used to like seeing such a positive response on social media. So it's been wonderful to see that. And obviously, we're not just catering to a US audience, we're catering to an international audience. And we also know that in all these other Latin American countries, there's a really very high level of understanding that there's a connection between climate change and extreme weather. So, but there's also this lack of information out there, which is why we're happy to be doing what we're doing, because we know from surveying our audience that we're a primary source of extreme weather information, as opposed to our English language audience, who is already well aware of extreme weather events and how to stay safe. I have numbers for that. I can share that later. But anyways, I will stop there and go to the next question.
Thank you guys for your comments. And I think something that we wanted to address in this particular webinar that you guys have explored in some of your work is just understanding that right now there is a lot of political tension and the politicization of the words climate change and any of the work related to equity that we're doing. And so one of the questions that I had for you guys is just how do you effectively communicate the need for climate adaptation solutions while trying to navigate the potential partisan divides and even misinformation that is spreading right now?
So with the Here Now project, it really, it was from the beginning our goal was how do you create a narrative here, a long form narrative that doesn't start with half the audience tuning out right away from the moment they hear the phrase climate change. And so I think we were working from a lot of that. Part of it is without talking heads and without narration, you're leaving a lot of gaps, informational gaps. But as Pearl just said, sometimes you don't need the information. You can just go with what people already know. And if you sort of overlay this additional language on it, it can start to turn people off. So it's the impact of extreme weather is universal for people. And so another thing that I think we realized was rather than focusing on kind of these long-term effects, these more sort of heady ideas or things that are distant from people like glaciers or polar bears or the things that were the symbolism of the kind of beginnings of this millennium's climate activism. It's really all about people. It's sort of you have to kind of get away from the sense that this is a selfish way of looking at it and realize that for most people, it's how does climate change affect people that's going to make a difference. So it's all about, in our film, it's all about seeing faces and being, kind of seeing through the eyes of the camera And then when you hear people talk through the camera mic, you're sort of hearing what they're thinking. And there's a kind of borderless empathy that gets developed that way, where it's not us against them. It's, oh my gosh, it sucks to get your house flooded if you're in Brooklyn, and it sucks to get your house flooded if you're in Indonesia. And we have that in common. And I think a sort of a focus on the commonality of the response to those impacts can really be a powerful thing.
Um, my role as a journalist is less to sort of offer up like a range of solutions or climate adaptation strategies, and more to show communities that this is happening, not just to them, but as you said, Greg, to others, and that they're not alone in this. I think a lot of communities right now are starting to see this phenomenon that climate researchers have warned about for a long time, called compounding disasters, where you're hit by a flood one year, a fire the next year, a hurricane the next year, or even in the case of Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is one place that I went for this large reporting project on disasters and how it's viewed, how they're viewed politically for Grist just recently. Um, that city was hit by, two back-to-back floods, and then two hurricanes, and then a spring flood. And so people there had disaster fatigue, and it really felt to a lot of people that there was no other option. They were doomed to be in this cycle forever. Now we're in this political moment where, prior to President Trump's election, there was a lot of money flowing to states and communities for the kind of adaptation projects that would have helped protect them from these events. And now we're seeing that funding rolled back, eliminated, frozen, at times illegally. We're seeing FEMA undergoing changes, already incredibly strapped agency, as you all likely know, undergoing massive changes. And so it's gonna be much harder to tell these stories going forward, because that element of we're all going through this, but there are ways out, it is a lot narrower. That story is now narrower, and it's really up to states and communities to decide whether they can afford to deploy solutions that will save houses and lives. And as you can likely imagine, some states will take that more seriously than others, and that's really what I'll be watching. I dropped my signal, by the way, in the group chat, or someone did for me, and then it's also, I think, up on the slide at the beginning. And so if anyone is sort of navigating that, my DMs are wide open. We're trying to tell those stories in ways that make sense. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, someone brought up the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation the Spanish speaking within Spanish speaking on Spanish speaking on platforms where you have Spanish speaking or Spanish language news. So there was actually a study that came out last year that was done by NYU and University of California, I believe. They found that especially on social media in Spanish, people were 11 to 20 points more percentage points more likely to believe in disinformation in comparison to people utilizing those platforms in English. So that is a huge thing that we are trying to focus on this year, especially. How do we combat that? I mean, both in English and in Spanish. I mean, we know it's prevalent in all languages, right? But I mean, obviously, these social media channels are not monitoring this really at all. So the only thing that we can think of is to start utilizing more of these platforms. So obviously, with Spanish speakers, utilizing WhatsApp. Both English and Spanish speakers utilize news as their primary news source. So we're going to try and utilize YouTube for that as well. But it's hard, and a lot of this disinformation comes from one little source, right? And then just spreads. I mean, it's like a disease. So it's really, really hard to fight, but you have to, I think, adapt and utilize the different platforms and utilize the platforms where this information is really sprouting up. And as both Greg and Zoya know, like after an extreme weather event, it just becomes even more rampant. And yeah, all you can do is like be consistent and keep putting this information out there in the hopes that it gets into the right hands. Obviously, with the Spanish language content that we have. I mean, I can only guess because I'm not a scientist and have not done any studies, but that a lot of the reasons that this disinformation has become so prevalent is because there are such huge news deserts for Spanish speakers. So it's so easy for this information to be latched onto. And hopefully we can do that more. I mean, we know that the National Weather Service is no longer going to translate any of its extreme weather notifications. So this is going to be an even huge, like much bigger problem going forward. So, I mean, you oftentimes feel so small in this fight, but you have to keep going.
One of the things, actually, probably you mentioned the consistency part of that seems so crucial because one of the things that we found in looking at the footage from climate disasters from around the world is there's this consistent pattern because the thing that unifies all of it is I've never seen this before. I've never experienced anything like this. That is the basically the tagline for climate change because it's all about weather that shouldn't be where it is, as bad as it is. And so there's a pattern that you see where it starts with people saying, oh, this is interesting and maybe even kind of fun. And then it goes, oh, this is actually not fun anymore. And then it becomes the worst thing I've ever experienced. And that pattern tracks consistently. And so it seems like there has to be, some way to think about this. Like the challenge is always at what point do you bring in the cause of all this? When do you bring climate change into the conversation as a disaster is unfolding? Because it can be so easily rejected as, oh, it's too soon for that, which is always the response. So that's where the sort of consistency and the refusal to kind of back down, when things aren't happening, that this is climate change, it is happening, it's happening now, and to sort of lay the groundwork so that people have an interpretive framework when these things happen to understand what is causing them. And that is a challenge that is massive. And, I don't know what you guys think, how you even sort of seed the ground so that people's first response is not something's, amiss with my government and this is a conspiracy, but rather this is climate change and we need to do something.
Yeah, just one thing. Sorry, Daniela, if I may just add something else. Someone had mentioned about attribution science and that it's oftentimes difficult to utilize it in layman's terms. I 100% agree. But there are some great organizations that are kind of creating something that is far easier, even for people like me, to utilize and make that connection. I mean, one great example of that is Climate Central. They have I use this all the time. So every time that we're covering a hurricane, I go to Climate Central's website and they have the climate shift index for the ocean. And so I can see how hot the water is where that hurricane is, and I can draw that connection. Like this hurricane was made, the water was 100 times hotter because of climate change, and therefore that this storm is the power it is, or it arrived on June 1st because of climate change, and that has helped exponentially in our reporting, and it's very easy to use.
Yes, thank you guys for all of your comments. And another question is just that since a lot of you guys do a lot more on the ground reporting, you guys get to see communities face to face. Just wondering about now that people seem to be more informed about climate change or if they're consuming your platform and your materials, just what kind of strategies or examples have you seen effectively move them just from simply being aware of climate change impacts, but also wanting to actually take action in the solutions as well?
A couple of years ago, I wrote a story that still sticks with me to this day and sends a chill through me. So I thought I'd share it here, which is that um, I got tipped off that groups like the Oath Keepers, far-right militias, were using the aftermath of disasters to move in and provide meals and a helping hand and very effectively sort of either fundraise or just drum up general goodwill for their causes. And I ended up spending a lot of time with the head of one of those groups. It's an offshoot of the Oath Keepers in Arizona called the Yavapai County Preparedness Team, which sounds just like an emergency management group or, a state or county outfit. But in fact, it's, people who espouse really, really right-wing views just absolutely fueled by conspiracy theories that are completely false. And the story that I ended up writing about that, it was quite long, but I found that it had a lot of impact among our readers because it not only showed that these disasters are happening, but it also showed what happens when state governments, federal governments, and communities aren't there for each other in the aftermath of these events, and how important it is to provide resources for people who are going through these, frankly, catastrophic events. And so, I keep thinking about that story too, because, I can understand why someone who doesn't know any better or is not necessarily thinking critically about who's helping them in the moment because they're, strung out, they're in a really bad way, there's no one to help them. I understand why they would turn to people who, oath keepers who used to work in the sheriff's office or anywhere else. It makes a lot of sense that that might happen. And so community networks helping each other out, is so vital. And there's gotta be a better state and federal infrastructure in place for encouraging healthy mutual aid. And so I plan to write more stories about that as they come up. But that's an example of one story that really felt to me like it was bridging the gap between like, okay, this thing is happening. Like, oh, it has these widespread impacts that actually filter back into, this move further right, especially online, and this kind of obsession with conspiracy.
Yeah, that story has been keeping me awake ever since Zoya first mentioned it to us. Um, I mean, interestingly though, but I think you've also done stories, right, where there's kind of another where the extreme event pushes people in a different direction as well. And I think that's one of the interesting things is you don't these events are radicalizing or can be radicalizing. We have there's an incredibly powerful piece of footage in the Here Now project where the town of Lytton, British Columbia, which burned down in a fire in 2021. And you see this young woman who's a young Indigenous woman who's just driving along and she's going to visit her mom to, make sure she's okay. It's in the middle of the Pacific Northwest heat dome. And she comes up to the town and sees it on fire. And you just see her face kind of crumble into sobbing and because of what she's witnessing. And she calls this her evil origin story. And since then, she has become she lived in a tent outside the town for a long time, and in that time became a climate activist and is now like negotiating treaties and doing all kinds of incredible stuff because of this horrible thing that happened to her town. So it feels like these are such massively disruptive events in people's lives that people can take different paths. And I guess the question becomes how do you intervene or how do you lay the groundwork beforehand to steer people toward a path that's more productive and not a path that is destructive?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, just even having these stories out there is important. We know from our scientific team at Yale that only 28% of the US hears or reads or listens to anything about climate change in the news on a weekly basis. Less so, like at just one story a week. That's a horribly low number. So people just aren't, meteorologists, journalists are just not making those connections. They're dancing around it because it has become such a political statement to make. So just even hearing those stories is extremely important. But from my personal experience of reporting, within the Spanish-speaking communities of the U.S. and the Caribbean and elsewhere is really just having people want to hear good stories. I mean, yes, the extreme weather, focusing on the extreme weather, that's definitely important. But talking about solutions, talking about how communities have made themselves more resilient in the face of or the aftermath of a hurricane or some extreme weather event. They do really well because people are hungry for these solutions focused stories. So it's important to remember that yes, covering extreme weather and focusing on, what happens is important, but also showing the potential solutions and how communities come together, as Zoya was talking about, and how Greg was talking about how people come together after these events is what one of the main things that people want to hear about. Because yeah, we're hungry for optimism, especially in the times that we're living in right now. So it's really, yeah, important to get those stories out and the effective storytelling, what Greg was saying. I mean, that was one of the most impactful moments for me in the documentary watching. And I think that you have to utilize different platforms to do that. So like having it in video like that and seeing that first response, the horror on her face to this town being burnt down was just so impactful. And then any person from any background, any age, uh, would be moved by that. So that's good storytelling. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we have to keep on doing.
I think all of that was spot on. Sorry, Daniel, I just want to quickly say, before, I don't want anyone in the audience to lose hope based on what we've said. I want to just relay that in my conversations with people on the ground, everyone's supremely reasonable. It's very rare that I run into someone who, you know, is espousing the conspiracy theories that I'm reading online even. So I think that the online world in terms of conspiracy and misinformation is a lot more rampant. I think that there was a study, I have to dig it up, that showed that much of that in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene was just bots. So people are inherently good. I do believe that. And I think that we can see examples of that all across the country. To Pearl's point that like this is happening. It's reported on less because it's less titillating than, horrific conspiracies leading to X problem. But there are good things in the works and I see them every day. And so, yeah, just a bit of I realize most of what I've said has been somewhat dire. So there's also good news out there.
Yeah, we like to think of it there's this continuum from kind of doom and gloom on one side and paralysis and what people have called toxic positivity on the other side, where it's all solutions and it's all abundance. And I think we've sort of landed somewhere in the middle that there's a pragmatic, realistic way of looking at this, that these are things are happening and they're terrible, but there's also extraordinary things happening and amazing work being done to help address the problem. And so we kind of landed on this framework of courage rather than optimism or pessimism or whatever, because it does seem like for ordinary people, for everyone who's on this Zoom, who's doing the work, that it takes courage, especially if if you're one of the few people in your community talking about this issue, it takes genuine courage to step out and say, hey, we got to do something about this. And that to me is that's always a potent framework to be thinking about this, that it takes courage and bravery, especially in this environment, to be trying to solve the problem.
Yes, all great comments. And so now we'll just move into our open Q&A. So our chat has been busy and there's some questions for our speakers. And so the first one, are there good examples of funders, government supporting community-driven mutual aid? Looks like they are looking for examples of supporting community-driven efforts that you guys have seen.
Mm-hmm.
Just so I focus a lot of when I get time to report, I focus a lot on the Caribbean. There's so many just in Puerto Rico alone, because obviously after Hurricane Maria, with the failure of both the federal and the governments to really mitigate what was going on. A lot of communities came together and started to work together on this problem. And there is one that comes to mind. It's called Casa Pueblo, and they're in the middle of the island, and they've been going around and creating microgrids
Mm.
for people, and it's awesome. I mean, I think honestly that is the way forward for Puerto Rico, especially having a macro grid is just not going to work with more and more hurricanes coming through. And they, yeah, they've done some great work. They do a lot of educational programs. I think it's casapueblo.org. You can buy coffee from them. Yeah, they're just a really, really cool organization. I think they actually just came up and visited Georgetown University. They've been very much like a pillar, an example of how community-driven projects can reach these bigger levels and empower more and more communities.
Thank you, Greg and Zoya. Do you guys have any other comments regarding this question?
No, just that's I think that's the work of the question asker to figure out what's happening in your community. That's the most effective strategy. That's what I've been doing in my there my folks live upstate, looking into, what programs exist. And that's what we all need to be doing in our various communities because, as Greg said, we're all going to be affected by this. It's not just to support mutual aid efforts, it's also so that you have a mutual aid program when, you are affected. Um, so I think just like, it's sort of a vague, broad answer, but just plugging in a little deeper to where you are is the most effective thing you can do in terms of supporting mutual aid.
And if I just might say one more thing, I mean, I've never been a data person, so I don't know how I'm coming out with all these numbers today. But another study that YPCCC had done was about collective action and how optimistic different demographics within the U.S. were. I think this was last year, so pretty recent. And what they found is that Hispanic communities, um, Black communities and Democrats too, were more optimistic in the power of collective action. And I honestly think that you go into any underserved community, you start to see these resiliency efforts going on because they know that they can't trust the government to help. Well, I mean, they might help a little bit, but like not to do it for them. So there's so many out there, but you go into so many of these communities that have just been sorely let down by their government, and you're going to find them.
Yeah, absolutely. And another question that was brought into the chat, and I'd also say for those who are having questions as you're listening to us talk, please feel free to also drop them in the chat and we will try to get to those as well. But the next question says, don't you find that people are more open to preventative and midterm adaptation actions since these actions are more tangible for them and can directly improve their quality of life, as they are implemented locally in contrast to climate mitigation contributing to a global goal?
I wonder if that question asker meant following an extreme weather event, whether that specific community is more inclined to support, preventative projects. Um, because if that is the question, then yeah, the research shows that yes, there's a period of time when communities are pretty excited about implementing climate adaptation. But it fades. Other priorities take center stage. Um, and suddenly, 5 years out from a major flood, the questions arise like, well, why are we spending our budget on this as opposed to something else? So, um, unfortunately, there's less staying power than one would hope, but also the research on this is sometimes contradictory that more needs to be done. We need to better understand how people think about post-disaster recovery. And then if the question is just are communities amenable to adaptation, the answer is it is ugly oftentimes, and difficult and expensive to adapt, to prepare for, to mitigate climate change in your communities by adaptation. And so selling communities on that requires really smart stakeholder and government kind of outreach and involvement. And if the local government can do that well, then it's a go. And if not, it's hard to drum up support.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we saw was the pattern in the film. We tell the beginning and the middle of 10 or 11 stories, but we never tell the end. And part of that was intentional because by starting in the beginning and middle and not quite getting to the end, you kind of you don't give people the sense that this is a discrete event, it's over, and now we can move on. It's sort of a way of communicating this is all one constant phenomenon. But when you do get to the end, every one of these events, no matter where it is, becomes incredibly political very quickly. It often becomes political while it's happening. And so I think one of the things that we've talked about disinformation and misinformation in kind of the conspiratorial way, but there's also a massive amount of money and effort and powerful actors who are going into making sure that the conversation never settles on this is climate change. And I think that is something that it's always very aggressive in the immediate aftermath of these things. It's too soon to talk about the tragedy. It's not climate change. It's something else. And that's a challenge that I think is really hard to face. What do you do in the face of organized, global, massively wealthy actors who are trying to keep the conversation from saying what this really is? And yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is, unfortunately. But it's a very real phenomenon, and I think it sort of puts a premium on something that what the premium hasn't been put on, which is the storytelling side. That there has to be, that this story has to be consistent and seeded in order for people to have a permission structure to believe it and not believe something else afterwards. So that is where I think this conversation is so crucial, and such a crucial conversation for people to be having in all their communities. How do we tell the story when bad things are happening, and how do we tell the story when bad things aren't happening? So the story's always there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the messed up thing is that we still even actually have to feel like we somehow have to actually prove that climate change is happening in every story, which is BS because it's been proven since like the 1960s, actually. So it's hard. It's hard on US soil to get that. Well, I mean, yeah, like Greg said, I mean, when you have Exxon, when you have all these different companies putting, allegedly a lot of money towards making sure that the real science isn't fully settled. It's very hard. It's very hard. It might potentially change as we get more and more lawsuits against companies moving forward. Actually, Puerto Rico, for example, they have a huge lawsuit against ExxonMobil for the damages caused by Hurricane Maria, which that's going to dig up a lot of interesting stuff as that pans out. But I don't even remember what the question was. But it's hard. It's hard to keep that momentum going for sure at times. But um, I also find that especially within Black and brown communities elsewhere in the world, like there is this realization that this is what's happening, and there is this want for things to move forward and for the mitigation to happen. Puerto Rico just got all their funding for climate mitigation pulled, so that's going to be a very, I don't know, sort of time this for the next however long. But yeah, the need is there, the will is there, and on an individual level as well, the will is there. It's just, yeah, the lack of resources, and sometimes, yes, this misinformation with the few bad players out there that just are louder than everyone else.
Mhm. I think there's a really good question that was put in the chat, and it says, how can we talk to the public about solutions to climate change when the real solutions all feel impossible, especially in the current political climate? I work on adaptation and I stay focused on how to best protect people from increasing coastal hazards, but I don't know what to say to people who ask me what we should do about climate change. I can't read the rest of it. It's hard to be defeatist.
Yeah, it always seems so I mean, that's always the big question. And the thing that is in some ways the first answer always feels so inadequate. Um, which is, it seems like a lot of the research says talking about it. That just the act of having the conversation is a starting point. And the more that other people know that other people are having the conversation, um, the more that there's a sense that there are other people who are thinking about this and caring about this. And, someday, especially as young people get older, we hope that there will be a critical mass where it feels like the tipping point will come all of a sudden. It may be too late, but it'll come all of a sudden. And so, that's where for us, for the film, the goal is to get it out there so that people hold screenings, people bring people into the same room, they watch the movie, they come to some sort of common ground emotionally about what all this is, and then you can have different conversations about the baby steps, the little things. In the film, that people go out and they take their phones out when extreme weather is happening, and they're not doing it because of climate change, but simply by shifting it into the context of this is a film about climate change. That video that you took becomes not just taking a video on your phone, it becomes bearing witness. And the act of bearing witness is a powerful thing. So it seems like we have lots of little tools and we have lots of little steps that people can take that will start you on the process of doing action, and then agency gives you the courage, and then the courage gets you to the hope, and the hope gets you to, of course, this is going to happen. Um, and I think there's all kinds of small steps that people can take in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I fight with it every day, trying to stay positive. It can definitely be difficult, but to Greg's point, what we keep repeating and what we actually know from our social scientist team is that just talking about climate change is one of the biggest things you can do. And what we try and offer on our website is all these different levers that people can pull. We know that, not everybody wants to go and lobby their local officials. Not everybody can afford to go get an EV, but just offering all these different solutions. Maybe you can compost, maybe you qualify for a heat pump or whatever. So we try and make it so it's not this you have to tackle everything all at once, but just offer people even the smallest levers make a difference. um and hopefully, and like, we have a solutions page. We have it in English, we don't have it in Spanish yet. We are going to have one in Spanish as well. I think it's important, yeah, just to kind of offer that and focus on that as much as possible. Because as we've already said before, people do get tired of hearing the negativity, and I think that will even be more so an issue, as we continue into this reality that we live in right now. So yeah, just offering as many options as possible is important.
Pass. I'm not in the I haven't quite gotten to the solutions up. I'm still assessing the damage right now. So I think Pearl, you put that beautifully, and we're gonna have to figure out what actual solutions look like going forward in the next, years.
And I think also, obviously political solutions, the individual solutions can only take us so far. It's about sort of using the individual solutions to build some kind of population level support for the policies and the politics. And that usually boils down to voting. And then it comes to, all right, politicians truly owning this issue, that the sense of like, you can't tackle this issue um, half-heartedly. You can't pretend like, oh, it's something we care about, but it's number 20 on our list, and let's not talk about it right before the election. It feels like, you know, whoever's going to take it on, whichever politicians do it, the authenticity of really going head on um, works, or can work, or should work. And I think beating around the bush, pretending like you care but you don't want to talk about it, is not the right way to handle it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so one of our tools we have on our website, not on Yale Climate Connections, but on YPCCC's website, is an opinion map. So you can go down to your county and see how many people in that area believe in climate change. And every time I bring that out in presentations or talk to people about it, they're always surprised just how high the number is. So as you know, you don't necessarily need to explore that, but figuring out how high that number is of people believing in climate change can be very helpful in giving people courage to go to their state officials, to, join their local climate group. I mean, I get it, like the individual action is not going to necessarily lead to, but you got to start somewhere, right? And like getting people together and getting people motivated and getting that collective action. I mean, that's kind of what we're in the midst of right now. So you have to start somewhere. I also believe in suing gas and oil companies, but I'm not a lawyer. So it's just kind of everyone has to do something to move forward, but also like not expecting everybody to move the whole world in order to get stuff done.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to ask one last quick question that I thought was interesting that came in before we wrap up. And it says, have you considered additional or different storytelling methods beyond just traditional online text and documentary media, like animation, comic books, graphic novels, thinking about how to reach different kinds of audiences?
We do have a great cartoonist that helps us. I don't know if he still draws for them for the New Yorker, but I love his comics. And I've actually seen them be like printed out and used in protests all across the country. I actually saw a bunch on Saturday. And they're very effective. They're very effective. People love that stuff. We just don't have the resources to go into other things, but I think, yeah, it's important. I mean, there's tons of novels out there that speak about climate change and climate change adaptation. So yeah, there's definitely so many other tools out there that we haven't been utilizing, but unfortunately, we're just such a small team that we don't have the woman power currently to do that.
Just want to throw when someone said it in the chat, we need a hit musical on climate change. That's a good one.
Yeah, I like the idea of climate change with an exclamation point coming up on Broadway. We're documentary filmmakers, and this is the how we tell our stories. But I feel very strongly that it is a all hands on deck across the board thing. We kind of feel necessary but wildly insufficient. So I love seeing climate stuff in other media. And I know there are people like, for example, folks from the Hollywood Climate Summit and other organizations are working to seed ordinary conversations into television, fictional television series, for example, just so, you see somebody in Hacks talking about electric vehicles. It's not like a focus. It's not made a big deal of. It's just, this is just ordinary conversation. This is what people talk about. And I think there's a sense where the normalization of this conversation is going to be a huge victory. where it's just a thing that people do and care about, and we don't have to say, and now here's our story on climate change, or here's our section on climate change. And I think that, that may be kind of a tell when we've hit a sort of a crucial narrative moment for all of us.
During the Dust Bowl, Woody Guthrie sang a lot of songs about the environmental destruction that was happening, but all of those songs were in some way connected to the housing crisis that, folks like him were undergoing, or the lack of food, lack of jobs, the migrant agricultural workers, all the people who were, yes, feeling the effects of an environmental disaster, but also feeling the effects in all their other facets of their lives. And to me, that feels like those are the stories I want to tell too, that touch not just climate change and how it affects your life, but also how it intersects with the other things that you care about. Someone posted in the chat that they're working on a marsh restoration project, and that yes, it'll help mitigate sea level rise, but also, it creates more shellfish or fishing habitat for fishers in their area, and that to me feels like a true climate solution because it touches um, some part of the economy and it touches a climate adaptation project, and it doesn't have to be one or the other; it can be both. Um, and to me, yeah, that feels like the way, yes, we can do a musical about climate change, but really it's just people need to feel these things in more than one touch point in their lives. And um, it's not just that, those things feel important and effective, but also they're the stories that I want to cover anyway. And so I guess I'm just going off of that.
Oh, and
Yes.
by the way, somebody suggested to us the other day that since true crime documentaries are the most popular documentaries, um, can you do a climate change documentary as a true crime film? And I think it's a great idea. So if anybody wants to join us on a group project and figure out how to tell this story as a true crime documentary, please get in touch because I think it's a great idea.
Wow, that is really cool. I would totally watch that. Um, Thank you guys so much, our panelists today, for joining us and talking with us, and for all the people asking in the chat. Yes, we will be sending out this recording and a follow-up email. This will include some resources that people have also shared throughout the session and that the panelists shared with us. And it will also encourage you guys, if you guys haven't had a chance to watch the Here Now Project film. It was sent to you guys in your Zoom reminders for the event, but in the follow-up email, it'll also include the link of how to watch the film if you guys are still curious. And just a quick wrap up, some plugs for Greg and his project that he's doing. If you guys are interested in hosting a screening, gathering your community together, whether it's at a school or a local community organization, or even your colleagues at your work, you can actually host a screening through his website and help support the project that he's doing. And for our audience in the San Francisco Bay Area, there will actually be a live screening of this film at the San Francisco Climate Week at Marines Memorial Theater on April 21st at 7 p.m. So you guys can check that out if you're in the area. And then just to wrap us up, some upcoming virtual National Adaptation Forum events. Later this fall, EcoAdapt team, who helps run the National Adaptation Forum, we will be hosting a webinar looking at practical tools for adaptation practitioners. This will be on September 9th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, and more details about this can be found on our mailing list and through our website. And that wraps up our webinar today. Thank you guys so much for participating, our panelists for coming out, and all of the people who were dropping resources in the chat that we can check out later, cool media and comic books I saw popping up. So I'm really excited to look at that stuff. And just thank you guys for joining us and taking time out of your day to be here. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.